Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian, and welcome to the second segment of my super long-form video, Oswald Acted Alone, the JFK Assassination Solved. If you're here and you have not seen the first segment of this two-video series, I really suggest you go back and start with that one. In this video, I'm going to take you through numerous aspects of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. And I am making the case that Lee Harvey Oswald, who shot the president from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, was the assassin and that he acted alone, not as part of a conspiracy. Now, I expect most people are going to watch this video out of sequence, using the chapters as a guide. I've organized this two-part video into chapter headings, which I've tried to make as descriptive and easy to find as possible, so you can skip around if you want to. We're beginning with this chapter, chapter 20, and I'm going to continue the numbering from the first section. For the ease of navigation, here's a list of all the chapters on the screen here, including those from section 1. So keep in mind chapters 1 through 19 are all in part 1. Now, throughout all of this, I hope to keep in mind that what we're getting at here is historical fact, what we can prove through the use of physical and documentary evidence. In the case of the Kennedy assassination, the historical facts have been obscured and severely distorted by 60 years of innuendo, conjecture, and outright falsehood and misrepresentation. As a historian, I think it's my job to stick to historical facts. That's what I'm presenting in these videos, including with citations to my sources, which you'll see in a minute. At the end of part 1, we left off with the subject of Oswald's finances, which are a powerful indicator that he was acting alone and not as part of a conspiracy. Now, let's get back into the fray with a discussion of the Warren Commission, which pretty much got it right despite all the criticism, most of it, excuse the pun, unwarranted. There are probably going to be a lot of people upset with me for posting these videos. I'm sure I'm going to make somebody out there mad in 100 different ways that I haven't anticipated, but I'd venture a guess that this is the conclusion that will be attacked most consistently, that the Warren Commission, the official investigation of the conspiracy, with very few exceptions, got it right. For those who would claim that the Warren Report, with its 26 volumes of backup exhibits, interviews, and evidence, is per se unreliable on its face so that we have to dismiss it out of hand, my response is, have you read it? And I don't mean all 26 supporting volumes of reference material, which are available for free online, by the way. I mean the summary report, this book. It's not that long. There were many particular printings. This particular one was done by the Associated Press, and it's 366 pages. There is no evidence that the Warren Commission was tainted or that it engaged in any significant acts of cover-up, omission, or obfuscation. Dismissal of the Warren Report is entirely result-driven. It concludes that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and many people are allergic to that conclusion, so by definition, the Warren Report must be a tissue of lies. You can only reach that result, though, if you ignore what it actually says. So, seriously, go through it. If it really is a tissue of lies, where are the lies? And you have to be specific here. Are they in the general summary of the assassination? Are they in the discussion of the bullets and the evidence linking them to Oswald's rifle, which we've already talked about? Are they in the discussion of Oswald himself? Are they in the part about Tippett's murder? Are they in the part about the attempted assassination of General Edwin Walker? Are they in the part about Oswald's finances? Are they in the transcripts where the Q&A with witnesses is given in exact detail? Now that is in the 26 volumes. Are they in the FBI reports, which are reproduced there? The photographs, Jack Ruby's polygraph examination. Seriously, where are the lies? Where are they? Which exact part, down to the page and paragraph, which exact part of this book is false? Which exact assertions are factually incorrect, and how do you know that they're factually incorrect? Almost all of the criticism of the Warren Commission is on that general high-level bird's-eye view. It can't be right because of its conclusions. Well, that's just not logical. Because if the evidence leads to a certain conclusion, don't blame the evidence if it leads to a conclusion you don't like. Furthermore, if the Warren Commission was a cover-up, then who was directing it? Lyndon Johnson? The FBI? Chief Justice Earl Warren? Hundreds of people worked on the Warren Commission. How could whoever was running the cover-up keep all of those people in line, especially the commission's main demographic, which was young, ambitious lawyers, many of whom had political aspirations, whose careers would have been helped, not hurt, if they had uncovered a conspiracy to assassinate JFK. In 2003, a lawyer named Bert Griffin, who was assistant counsel for the Warren Commission back in 1964, said this, quote, "The accusation that we had a predetermined idea to find that there was no conspiracy is completely false. The one thing I wanted to do was find a conspiracy. I was a 32-year-old lawyer. I had political ambitions. If I could have found that Oswald didn't do it, I would have been the senator from Ohio, not John Glenn." End quote. The Warren Commission took testimony from 552 witnesses, almost all of them under oath or through sworn affidavits. They did not rely on the FBI to do the investigation, as has been alleged. Numerous Warren Commission staffers went out into the field to conduct their own interviews and investigations. In addition, significant legwork was done by the Secret Service, the U.S. Army, and the Dallas Police Department. How were LBJ or Earl Warren or J. Edgar Hoover or whoever was supposed to be in charge, how were they supposed to control all of these agencies? If this was a cover-up, where were the whistleblowers? There always are. How many witnesses deposed by the Warren Commission took to the newspapers to say that they'd been misquoted or that their testimony was fabricated? How many young government bureaucrats just couldn't live with themselves anymore, knowing what they'd done, and decided to turn coat against the cover-up? None. Zippo. Absolutely zero. Nobody falls into that category. If the Warren Commission was a massive cover-up, you would expect all of this, and none of that happened. Furthermore, if the Warren Commission is a tissue of lies, how come so many other pieces of evidence, which were not brought to light by the Warren Commission, support its conclusions? If it was a cover-up, don't you think it would be really easy to debunk? Example, back in Chapter 9, I told you about fingerprints found on the trigger of Oswald's rifle, which were matched to, guess who? Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, that evidence was not available to the Warren Commission because the technology to process such fine-grained photographic images of fingerprints did not exist until the 90s. The murderer's fingerprints on the murder weapon, conclusive evidence, strong enough by itself to have sent Lee Harvey Oswald to death row without any other evidence. That is absolutely consistent with the conclusion of the Warren Commission. Why, if the commission was either corrupt or botched the job, does all the evidence discovered after the commission's investigation point to exactly the same conclusion that the Warren Commission reached? Now, the House Select Committee on Assassinations is a special case, and I'm going to get there in Chapter 29. But my point is, if there are so many problems with the Warren Commission, shouldn't it be easy to refute? And it isn't. It's really hard. And the reason why it's hard is because you have to get around all of the overwhelming evidence of Oswald's sole guilt, a lot of which, I might add, was compiled even before the Warren Commission came into existence. Here's what I mean by that point specifically. The major pieces of evidence that point to Oswald's guilt, the rifle found in the sniper's nest with his fingerprints all over it, the shell casings, the identification of Oswald after the assassination and after the murder of Tippit, all of that investigation work was done by the Dallas Police Department, much of it on the afternoon of the assassination itself. So before the Warren Commission was even an idea, it wasn't proclaimed until a couple of days later, even before that, the Dallas District Attorney felt that the Dallas police alone, without working with federal investigators, the Dallas police alone had collected enough evidence to charge Oswald with the murder of President Kennedy and with the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit. And those charges were made even before midnight on November 22nd. If the Warren Commission was either corrupt or botched the job, how come the Dallas police and the DA reached the exact same conclusion they did without the benefit of 9 exhaustive months of investigation that the Warren Commission had time to pursue? If the Warren Commission was either corrupt or botched the job, how come its conclusions have been reaffirmed with every subsequent investigation and proceeding, including the 1986 mock trial of Oswald in London, which an independent jury of Dallas, Texas citizens who were on the voter rolls in 1963 reached a verdict of guilty? If the Warren Commission did such a bad job, how come there's so little evidence of their mistakes? I mean, if it really was that egregious, it should be easy to find examples of how they screwed up, right? Again, where are they? Which specific assertions in this book are false? And how do you know that they're false? As a historian, and as one who's looked at various false narratives of history, I'd like to think that I'm pretty adept at spotting bad sources. You can usually tell. They're light on citations, if there are any at all. They don't rely on primary sources. It's hard to find whatever sources they do rely on. And the arguments made by these kinds of sources are pieced together with speculation rather than logical reasoning. The Warren Commission has none of those problems. It's supported by literally 26 volumes of supporting material, almost all primary sources, such as interviews or contemporaneous documents. And you can look at these materials anytime you want, and you can match the source to what they say it said. It's easy to find what they're citing. Arguments made in the Warren Report are cautious and assiduously avoid speculation. Incidentally, take any JFK conspiracy book and judge it against those standards that I just explained, and it won't measure up. But curiously, somehow, the Warren Commission does. Look, this is a solid source. Now, it's not perfect. Nothing made by human hands, especially a government committee, ever could be. But its basic conclusion that Oswald did it and that he acted alone is absolutely supported by the evidence it cites. In short, the Warren Commission got it right. For the past 60 years, there's been a great deal of controversy about President Kennedy's autopsy. Now, I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail here for a number of reasons. I'm definitely not going to show grisly autopsy images or describe bullet wounds in horrific detail, both due to YouTube's content restrictions and also because I'm just grossed out by the whole subject. I mean, I don't like this stuff. The autopsy of the president was performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland after Kennedy's body was brought back to the Washington area aboard Air Force One. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations thoroughly reviewed the autopsy and wrote a report critical of it in a number of significant ways. But it's interesting to note that their criticism was procedural. The completeness of the autopsy and the precise qualifications of those who performed it. So it was procedural, not substantive. Basically what that means is the way the autopsy was performed left a lot to be desired. It wasn't as complete as it could have been, and the people who were doing it probably weren't the ones that you would have chosen in an ideal situation. But as to its actual conclusions, meaning its findings about where the bullets came from and what happened to the physical person of President Kennedy, the H.S.C.A. did not find any grounds to dispute it. Essentially, in a nutshell, the autopsy could have been better, but it came to the right conclusions. So basically what they found was this. President Kennedy had 2 holes in his skull, one in the rear to the upper right side of his head. That small hole was where Oswald's bullet, probably the 3rd shot that he fired, entered the back of the head. The large damage to the upper right side of the head was the exit wound. You can, if you must, see the results of that in frame 313 of the Zapruder film, absolutely conclusive that the fatal shot came from behind the direction of the Texas School Book Depository. President Kennedy also had two other bullet wounds. One was at the base of his neck and slightly to the right of his spine. That was an entry wound. The other was to the front of his neck. However, by the time of the Bethesda Naval Hospital autopsy, that wound had been obscured by an emergency tracheotomy that the doctors performed at Parkland Hospital shortly after Kennedy got there. So what happened there was clearly this. Kennedy was hit by a bullet also fired from behind him, probably Oswald's second shot, which passed through his neck and went on in a straight line, not an S-curve, to hit Governor John Connally. The only reason why there's been controversy about this point with respect to the autopsy is because that tracheotomy, those incisions for that, obliterated the evidence which otherwise would have been conclusive that that was an exit wound, not an entry wound. But note this, the tracheotomy, which obviously didn't end up accomplishing much, was done by doctors at Dallas's Parkland Hospital, not the naval surgeons at Bethesda. So the Bethesda autopsy did not destroy evidence. Conspiracy theorists love to claim that this neck wound was an entry wound, which proved that somebody was shooting from Kennedy from the front, from the grassy knoll area. I already explained how we know that was not the case. In any event, there were no exit wounds of bullets anywhere on the back side of Kennedy's body, including his head. All wounds, meticulously cataloged by the autopsy, came from behind. Now, if you doubt me on this, consider the story of Dr. Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist who was called upon in 1978 to evaluate the medical case for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Dr. Wecht was a longtime conspiracy theorist, and he dissented from the H.S.C.A. panel on almost every issue, firmly believing and publicly maintaining for years that there was an assassin on the grassy knoll and thus a conspiracy. Yet this guy, an absolute paragon of the conspiracy community, conceded first in 1978 before the H.S.C.A. and again in the year 2000 when talking to historian Vincent Bugliosi. He conceded that, direct quote, "I believe that the president was struck definitely twice, one bullet entering the back and one entering the back of the head," end quote. If one of the most consistent arch conspiracy theorists in America concedes that there's no evidence that Kennedy was struck by bullets coming from in front of him, I think that's pretty telling. 3 more issues regarding the autopsy are worth going into. First, conspiracy theorists generally love the stories of Dr. Robert McClelland, who was one of the doctors at Parkland Hospital, not one of the autopsy surgeons at Bethesda. He claimed through the years that he saw a wound to the back of Kennedy, an exit wound to the back of Kennedy's head. He thought this in part because of the type of brain tissue that he thought he saw around the wound. That's about as close as I'm going to get to grisly descriptions. Suffice it to say, there is a type of brain matter housed at the rear of the brain, which is different than the kind near the front or the top. Other Parkland surgeons who were there state that it was almost impossible to tell what was going on with that wound, and Dr. McClelland was clearly mistaken. Furthermore, Dr. McClelland and Dr. Charles Crenshaw, another Parkland doctor who claimed there were wounds to the back of Kennedy's head, exit wounds, were not in a good position to see it, according to witnesses in the trauma room. In fact, those doctors didn't even turn the president's body over at Parkland Hospital, and they weren't doing anything close to an autopsy. Their sole purpose was to try to resuscitate him if they could, not to do an autopsy. It's erroneously asserted by conspiracy theorists that all or most of the Parkland doctors who saw Kennedy that day claimed they saw exit wounds to the back of the head. That's untrue. Some gave descriptions at first that were equivocal or which could support that interpretation. But into the 1980s and 1990s, 2 and only 2 continued to claim that. and those were Dr. McClelland and Dr. Crenshaw. Everyone else conceded that the autopsy photos, which do not show a rear exit wound, are absolutely conclusive. Dr. Crenshaw, incidentally, is not a reliable source. In the 90s, he published a ridiculous book called JFK Conspiracy of Silence, in which he accused the other Parkland doctors of conspiring to cover up the real facts. The other Parkland doctors roundly and unanimously refuted his claims. Crenshaw's book is utter nonsense, like all JFK conspiracy books. Second issue. In the 1969 trial of Clay Shaw, the Jim Garrison investigation, which I'll get into in due course, a doctor named Pierre Fink testified that someone at the autopsy said, "Who's in charge here?" And an Army general whose name Fink did not recall replied, "I am." This moment was in fact dramatized in Oliver Stone's 1991 movie JFK, and conspiracy theorists take it to mean that some Army general was controlling and directing the autopsy. However, what the movie doesn't show you is that the next day on the stand, that same doctor, Pierre Fink, qualified that testimony. In response to the question, what was the name of the general who was in charge of the autopsy, Pierre Fink said, quote, "Well, there was no general in charge of the autopsy. There were several people, as I've stated before. I heard Dr. Humes state who was in charge here, and he stated that the general answered, 'I am.' It may have been pertaining to operations other than the autopsy. It does not mean that the Army general was in charge of the autopsy. It may have been who was in charge of operations, but not of the autopsy, and by operations, I mean the overall supervision." End quote. So you see, the doctors did not testify that the medical conduct of the autopsy was being directed by military personnel. They weren't cooking the books on the autopsy as conspiracy theorists want you to think, by suggesting that somehow these pathologists were being bullied into saying things that the wounds to President Kennedy were different than they really were. That clearly did not happen. The third and final issue for this chapter is a deeply stupid book by conspiracy theorist David Lifton, published in 1981, called Best Evidence, which spins a bizarre and completely impossible theory that Kennedy's body was stolen from Air Force One, and then secret conspiratorial doctors altered the bullet wounds to make it look like shots came from the rear, when in fact they came from the front. This book is absolutely unhinged, almost as dumb as the Bonar, Menninger, and Bill Cooper theory that the Secret Service did it. Now, Lifton's book is nuts, but unfortunately it got mainstream acceptance and was even on the New York Times bestseller list for a while in the 80s. The supposed smoking gun of this lunatic theory is a single sentence in a report by 2 FBI agents that accompanied the president's body to Bethesda Naval Hospital, in which one of them said it looked like there was, quote, "surgery of the head area." First, that statement was made offhandedly by one of the pathologists, Dr. Humes, as soon as they unwrapped Kennedy's body, but before they started examining it. The gunshot wound was to the top, the exit wound was to the top front of the president's head, and it was so catastrophic that it looked at first like part of the skull had been removed surgically. But then it became clear when they actually started the autopsy that this was, in fact, the wound from Oswald's fatal headshot. The 2 FBI agents who wrote the report that Lifton seized on confirmed that that was how it happened. Second, for many practical reasons, Lifton's theory absolutely could not have happened. It is totally impossible. But the real death knell for Lifton's insane claims is the simple proven fact that Kennedy's casket was never left unattended aboard Air Force One. In 1981, when Best Evidence was published, Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh wrote in Time magazine that he was never away from the casket from the time it left Parkland Hospital to the time it went into the autopsy room, except for a few minutes. And during those few minutes, Jackie Kennedy and 2 other aides were with it. So it simply could not have happened. Best Evidence is just totally false. And with that, and a sigh of relief, quite frankly, we're going to leave the gory subject of the autopsy. I've already explained how we know that Jack Ruby did not kill Lee Harvey Oswald for the Mafia or for anybody else. But what about the oft-repeated suggestion that the Mafia was behind the main assassination of the president? It sounds good, but the more you know about the Mafia, the less likely it seems. And the fact is that there is absolutely zero evidence that the Mafia did it, and there absolutely would be if they had. Robert Kennedy, as JFK's Attorney General, was leading a coordinated federal assault on organized crime during John Kennedy's term in office. The most spectacular part of this takedown was when Mafia underboss Joseph Valachi turned state's evidence in 1962. Valachi, who had been in the mob for 30 years by that point, appeared as the star witness in federal hearings beginning on September 27, 1963, just shy of 2 months before the assassination. But why would the Mafia have whacked Kennedy? What, as revenge? The damage had already been done. It's not like the Justice Department would lay off them if they realized that they had killed the president. Indeed, Bobby Kennedy remained Attorney General for a year into Lyndon Johnson administration. So if the idea was to get the federal government off the back of the Mafia, the assassination did not work. In fact, if they had been exposed as being involved in the assassination, the Mafia could expect the federal government's retaliation to be so overwhelming that it would absolutely annihilate them. Bobby Kennedy was a tough, ruthless, and tenacious man. If you told him that the mob whacked his brother, he would have gone to the end of the earth to utterly destroy them. Plus, we've seen that Oswald was totally unreliable and would not have and did not work with anyone in planning the assassination. The Mafia would have been completely nuts to use him as a hitman. Why would they trust, in the first place, anyone outside their organization? And we know for a fact that Oswald did it, all of the ballistics evidence, the fingerprints, eyewitnesses, etc. So the only way that the Mafia could have been involved is if they did employ Oswald as the triggerman, which is clearly impossible. The only other thing I want to say about this issue is to read you a quote from the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It's lengthy, but I think it's dispositive of this whole Mafia theory. I'll give you the cite first, there it is, and then I'll read it. Now, what you need to know here is that the Mafia was at this time controlled by a commission, a sort of leadership committee of the main Mafia families, which determined its overall policy, especially on who to kill and who not to. So that's what the word commission means in this quote. You also need to know that the federal government had most of the major mafiosi bugged. They absolutely knew what they were up to, thanks to, guess who, Bobby Kennedy and his aggressive Justice Department campaign against organized crime. So here it is, quote, "The committee's review of the surveillance transcripts and logs detailing the private conversations of the commission members and their associates revealed that there were extensive and heated discussions of the serious difficulties the Kennedy administration's crackdown on organized crime was causing. The bitterness and anger with which organized crime leaders viewed the Kennedy administration are readily apparent in the electronic surveillance transcripts. While the committee's examination of the electronic surveillance program revealed no shortage of such conversations during that period, the committee found no evidence in the conversations of the formulation of any specific plan to assassinate the president. The committee concluded that had the National Crime Syndicate as a group been involved in a conspiracy to kill the president, some trace of the plot would have been picked up by the FBI, surveillance of the commission. Given the far-reaching possible consequences of an assassination plot by the commission, the committee found that such a conspiracy would have been the subject of serious discussion by members of the commission, no matter how guarded such discussions might have been. Some trace of them would have emerged from the surveillance coverage. It was possible to conclude, therefore, that it is unlikely that the National Crime Syndicate as a group, acting under the leadership of the commission, participated in the assassination of President Kennedy." End quote. And in case you have any fantasies that some rogue mafioso took it upon himself to whack the President of the United States, again I say, the more you know about how the mafia worked at this time, the less likely that is. Had someone done that, incurring potentially existential level retaliation by the federal government against organized crime, the commission would themselves have served up the guy who did it in an attempt to minimize the damage to them. So, the mafia didn't do it, folks. It just doesn't make any sense. And in any event, there's no evidence. Another favorite theory among the tinfoil hat crowd, and apparently Oliver Stone's favorite theory, is that the military, or people associated with the military-industrial complex working with the CIA, assassinated Kennedy, because he was planning, supposedly, to pull U.S. troops out of Vietnam, or because he had otherwise offended the delicate sensibilities of the CIA. According to this historically ignorant line of thinking, they wanted the war, they were afraid they wouldn't get it, so they just bumped Kennedy off. As usual, to make this theory work, you have to be totally ignorant of how the United States got drawn into the Vietnam War. At the time of Kennedy's assassination, there were thousands of U.S. troops, euphemistically called advisors, in South Vietnam, helping to prop up that country's corrupt pro-U.S. regime against the communist North Vietnam that wanted to take it over. But the truth is that Kennedy was not planning to pull U.S. troops out of Vietnam. In Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, in the section involving Donald Sutherland as a rogue CIA agent who spills the beans, 3 national security documents are mentioned as supposed proof of Kennedy's plan. These are National Security Action Memorandums 55, 56, and 57. But these documents do not say what Oliver Stone says they say. I'll put the citations on the screen. These documents are in the JFK library. They're digitized online, and you can go read them yourself if you like. They just don't say anything of the kind that's mentioned in this scene. They're pretty routine bureaucratic tinkers with the CIA's scope of operations. Furthermore, these documents are from early in Kennedy's term, 1961. The CIA is supposed to be super offended by these documents, so they wait 2 years to whack JFK. Not likely. But there's also a piece of logical reasoning that proves this theory is nuts. If the military or the CIA assassinated Kennedy to get their way on Vietnam, how did they know that his successor, Lyndon Johnson, was guaranteed to do what they wanted? I mean, they wouldn't go to all the time and trouble to set up an elaborate assassination plot if LBJ wasn't going to be any better for them, right? In reality, Lyndon Johnson was extremely reluctant to escalate the Vietnam War by committing massive U.S. forces to direct combat, which he did not do, I might add, until July 1965, nearly 2 years after the assassination. In fact, Johnson dithered on this decision as long as he possibly could. And no, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, passed in August 1964, does not indicate otherwise. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, contrary to popular belief, was not ginned up to give the president authority to wage war in Vietnam. If you're interested in this subject, which includes very specific historical analysis of the Tonkin Gulf incident, which did happen, by the way, though it was misperceived by military authorities. Anyway, I teach an in-depth online course about the Vietnam War on my website, seanmunger.com. The Tonkin Gulf stuff and this whole process of Kennedy's and LBJ's decision-making on Vietnam is in Unit 2 of this course. So go there and knock yourself out, but you do have to pay for the tuition fee to get access to the course. So the link to that course is in the description. When I was doing the initial edit of this chapter, I realized there was likely to be a lot of pearl clutching and apoplexy among certain of my viewers at my statement that the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened. This is a brief digression into that issue, not specifically to do with the JFK assassination directly, but it is worth taking just a minute or two to dispose of this issue. In early August 1964, 2 U.S. Navy warships on patrol off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin believed that they came under attack by North Vietnamese patrol boats. President Lyndon Johnson, then campaigning for election in his own right, pressed Congress and received broad-ranging legal authority to commit American forces directly to combat in Vietnam to counter North Vietnamese aggression, as it was worded. This was the famous Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Now, conventional wisdom has crystallized, much as it has in the JFK case, around a distortion and misrepresentation of historical events. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was not made up, ginned up, or a false flag, as modern conspiracy theorists would have you believe. There were, in fact, 2 incidents off the coast of North Vietnam in the early days of August 1964. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The Maddox returned fire and sank one of those boats. This attack absolutely did occur. Not only were North Vietnamese shell fragments discovered on the deck of the Maddox, but in 1998, years after the war, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara spoke to the North Vietnamese military naval commander who had ordered the attack on the Maddox. This man's name was General Nguyen Dinh Duc. Nguyen explained how the attack on the Maddox came about. There's absolutely no question that this attack occurred. Even the Vietnamese admitted it. 2 days later, on August 4th, 1964, another U.S. ship, the Turner Joy, reported that it was about to suffer a similar attack, a conclusion that officers aboard the ship reached by looking at radar returns. This was almost certainly a misperception. There was no attack on the night of August 4th. However, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, when he reported these attacks to President Lyndon Johnson, did not include mention of a follow-up report that McNamara had received from the Turner Joy correcting their earlier report and casting doubt as to whether they had really been under attack on the night of August 4th. So, to the extent that somebody in this story made a deliberate misrepresentation, that was it. And McNamara later admitted this. So to be clear, the Gulf of Tonkin consisted of 2 attacks, one of which absolutely did occur and is documented to have occurred and was admitted by the Vietnamese, and the second, which almost certainly did not occur. The political spin that resulted from the Gulf of Tonkin attack is an entirely separate issue and far beyond the scope of this video. But from the standpoint of historical fact, I am absolutely on solid ground asserting that the Gulf of Tonkin incident did occur. Okay, so now let's return to the issue of whether the CIA or the military assassinated John F. Kennedy in order to facilitate the war in Vietnam. They did not. In any event, we circle eventually back around to the same problem that you've got with any claim of some group or another being behind the assassination. We know for a fact that Oswald did it, and there's no way that Oswald would have worked with the CIA or the military or anyone else to assassinate Kennedy. The CIA and the military, for God's sake, hiring a 24-year-old warehouse worker with a mail-order rifle to carry out the most sensitive and dangerous covert operation in their entire history, it's absolutely preposterous. So, the military didn't do it. The CIA didn't do it. Lyndon Johnson didn't do it. Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and he did it alone. The theory that the Secret Service had something to do with Kennedy's assassination is so abysmally stupid that it demeans anyone who stoops so low as to try to refute it empirically. Unfortunately, this theory, or variations on it, ridiculous as they may be, are very popular. I encounter them virtually every time I speak up on the topic of the JFK assassination. So a lot of people are familiar with them, and unfortunately, I have to address them. Now, there are basically 2 popular Secret Service conspiracy claims. One was promulgated by a firearms expert, Howard Donahue, who teamed up with a writer, Bonar Menninger, to write a scorching hot expose in 1992 called Mortal Error. In this book, Menninger and Donahue claim that Secret Service agent George Hickey, who was riding in Lyndon Johnson's car in the motorcade, accidentally shot JFK with an AR-15 in an unsuccessful attempt to return Oswald's fire. In other words, this theory maintains that Oswald fired 2 shots, one that missed, the second one being the one that hit Kennedy in the back of the neck and went on to wound Governor John Connally. The third shot supposedly came from Hickey, the Secret Service agent, who slipped and lost his footing just as he was bringing up his gun to fire back at Oswald. Now, this is utterly ridiculous. Of hundreds upon hundreds of witnesses in Dealey Plaza who were looking right at the presidential and vice presidential limos, no one saw this, even though we have a witness who actually saw Oswald firing at Kennedy and more than one who saw him at the window. How come we have no witnesses of this supposed accidental Secret Service shooting? Furthermore, Hickey himself testified to the following, quote, "At the end of the last report," meaning Oswald's third shot, not his second, "I reached to the bottom of the car and picked up the AR-15 rifle, cocked and loaded it, and turned to the rear. At this point, the cars were passing under the overpass, and as a result, we left the scene of the shooting," end quote. We also know that Menninger's accidental shooting theory could not have happened because Oswald is proven to have fired 3 shots, not 2. There were 3 shell casings found in the sniper's nest, and the vast majority of witnesses heard 3 shots from the direction of the schoolbook depository. So this theory is absolute crap. The second popular Secret Service shooting theory comes from a disgusting anti-Semitic book written in 1991 by arch conspiracy theorist Milton William Cooper called Behold a Pale Horse. Cooper laid the groundwork for the totally unhinged conspiracy nuttery of the kind that Alex Jones, David Icke, and QAnon have come to champion. In Behold a Pale Horse, Cooper asserts that the driver of JFK's limo, William Greer, turned around and shot Kennedy to prevent him from exposing the truth about aliens. Yes, aliens. Cooper claims that this shooting of Kennedy is clearly visible in the Zapruder film. He even puts this assertion in capital letters, which you know must be extra persuasive. When this crackpot limo theory driver has been presented to me, the claim that it's visible in the Zapruder film is usually attached, thus demonstrating that whoever is proffering this theory is a fan of William Cooper and Behold a Pale Horse. Other fans of William Cooper and Behold a Pale Horse included charming folks like Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in 1995, and also Q, the anonymous provocateur who launched the whole QAnon conspiracy cult. That's how extreme this book is. In any event, the Zapruder film shows nothing of the kind, not even close. And as we know, the autopsy and all the other evidence, including the bullet fragments found in the limo, clearly indicate that Kennedy was shot from the rear, not the front. None of the hundreds of witnesses to the event saw Greer shooting Kennedy. The bullet fragments matched Oswald's rifle, not a Secret Service-issued firearm. And why am I even talking about this? Because it's so nuts. Know who else was nuts? Milton William Cooper, who was a far right-wing libertarian who refused to pay his taxes and was killed in a shootout with police in 2001. The Secret Service shooting theories, whether accidental or deliberate, are just absolute ridiculous nonsense. I can't even believe that I had to put this in my video, but if I didn't, somebody would bring it up in the comments. The Secret Service did not shoot Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy, and he did it alone. Now we get into the subject of Jim Garrison, Clay Shaw, and David Ferrie, which also brings us to the subject of Oliver Stone and the 1991 film JFK. Now this is a gigantic subject, and I'm only going to scratch the surface here. Before I start, I'll direct you to a terrific source on this subject. More than 20 years ago, in 2001, a young man named David Reitzes, an independent researcher of the assassination, wrote a long, extremely detailed, and very, very well-sourced critique of the JFK movie. It's called the JFK 100, and it lists the top 100 distortions, lies, and inaccuracies in the film. More than 20 years later, this site is still online, and it's still a fantastic step-by-step analysis of why the JFK movie is fiction, and it explains the egregious violence that it does to the historical and factual record. In 1966, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison took it upon himself to launch an investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy. There was a slight nexus with New Orleans in the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had spent part of the summer of 1963 in New Orleans before moving back to Dallas, but honestly that was about it for the connection to New Orleans. In reality, Jim Garrison was a kooky conspiracy theorist who believed almost every theory he heard, and he decided to use his platform as New Orleans DA to launch a broadside attack against the Warren Commission. Not only did he chase ridiculous leads that were completely illusory. For example, he thought that if someone had once lived on the same street as Lee Harvey Oswald, even years apart, that this was proof that the person knew him. But he also egregiously abused his prosecutorial office to gain publicity for himself and his weird theories. Ultimately, Garrison scapegoated a well-known New Orleans businessman, Clay Shaw, and in March 1967 charged him with conspiracy to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. It took quite a while and a great deal of indecision for him to finally settle on Shaw as the target, mainly because the person that Garrison had originally wanted to charge, David Ferrie, a former pilot and Catholic priest, had inconveniently died just before he was about to be charged. This was in the midst of a frenzy of media coverage of the investigation. Ferrie, who's played by Joe Pesci in Oliver Stone's film, is shown in the movie as being murdered under mysterious circumstances. In reality, it's very clear that he died of natural causes, but the effect of his various illnesses was apparently exacerbated by the badgering that the Garrison investigation was doing of him right up until his death. Members of Garrison's DA office, who were extremely uncomfortable at his unethical tactics, heaved a sigh of relief when Ferrie died because they thought the investigation would fizzle out. Instead, Garrison just took the spotlight and shifted it to Clay Shaw, who was indicted basically out of spite because Ferrie had slipped through Garrison's fingers. Basically, it didn't matter who the defendant was. Garrison wanted a trial where he could parade kooky witnesses on the stand to talk crap about the Warren Commission. He may not even have really believed that Clay Shaw had anything to do with the assassination. He presented absolutely no evidence that Shaw did. Garrison's entire case was built around one extremely unreliable witness, a Baton Rouge insurance salesman named Perry Russo, who told Garrison that while he was visiting David Ferrie's apartment in New Orleans in September 1963, Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald were there and discussed killing Kennedy. The problem was that Russo told this story for the first time only in 1967, and only after being hypnotized, shot up with sodium pentothal by members of Garrison's prosecutorial team. In 1971, Russo in fact recanted the story about the September 1963 meeting and told lawyers for Clay Shaw, who was suing Jim Garrison for his malicious prosecution, that he was drugged and that his testimony was false. Garrison had threatened to charge him with perjury if he changed his story. Russo's story, which we now know is false, was the whole basis of Garrison's case. There was absolutely no evidence that Shaw or Ferrie knew Oswald or even knew each other. The trial of Clay Shaw was such a farce that the jury took one vote and came back in less than an hour with a verdict of not guilty. One of Garrison's own prosecutors, Milton Brenner, said, quote, "Of course, Shaw was innocent. The entire case against him was a figment of Garrison's imagination. He pulled it completely out of thin air." End quote. Garrison got on Oliver Stone's radar screen in 1988 when he, Garrison, published a highly false and misleading account of his own investigation, On the Trail of the Assassins, which was a major basis for the movie. Up until then, Garrison in fact had been shunned by most JFK conspiracy theorists for having made a mockery of their entire movement. None of the serious problems with the Garrison investigation seemed to bother Oliver Stone, who played so fast and loose with the facts that what emerged on screen was basically an entirely fictional story. However, the testimony of Perry Russo, which, as you recall, was induced by drugs and hypnosis, and in any event recanted by him sometime later, this proved so problematic that Stone didn't even make Russo a character in the movie, instead giving most of his lines to an entirely fictional character, Willie O'Keefe, played in rather homophobic fashion by Kevin Bacon. Proof positive that the film JFK is a fabrication. Stone does not even mention the overwhelmingly conclusive evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald did it. The 3 shots fired, Stone claims there were 6, the fingerprint evidence, the curtain rod story, the ballistics evidence, all of that, which we've been through. He deliberately lies about the 5.6 seconds thing. I demonstrated that earlier. He lies about Ferrie's death. He lies egregiously about the testimony of Julie Ann Mercer and Beverly Oliver. He repeats the lie about the bullet doing an S-turn in midair. All of these are proven falsehoods. For my money, though, the worst and most misleading lie told by the JFK picture comes right before the closing credits. Text on the screen informs us that, quote, in 1979, Richard Helms, director of covert operations in 1963, admitted under oath that Clay Shaw had worked for the CIA, end quote. Now that seems to validate Stone's basic thesis, that Shaw was guilty and that the whole thing was a CIA plot, right? Except it's totally fake. Clay Shaw did not work for the CIA. As a prominent businessman who traveled extensively in Latin America, the CIA had a program called the Domestic Contact Service, where people who traveled abroad described conditions that they observed in foreign countries. Shaw was one of thousands of ordinary people, including tourists and students, who at one time or another gave a statement to the CIA's Domestic Contact Service. Richard Helms, later director of the CIA, asserted in a deposition in a libel lawsuit that Clay Shaw's name was on a list of thousands of others who had done this exact same thing, and Shaw had contacted the Domestic Contact Service no later than 1956, 7 years before the assassination. He was not a CIA agent. He was not a CIA employee. He no more worked for the CIA than it could be said that an eyewitness to a car accident worked for the police department by giving them a description of what happened. The JFK movie is actually, as a piece of cinema, well made, and I enjoy it. It might surprise you to learn that. Here, in fact, is my DVD copy of it, which I've had for years. But it's fiction. It is not history, and it's not accurate. Jim Garrison ruthlessly and recklessly prosecuted an innocent man who had literally nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. Neither did David Ferrie. And none of the fiction depicted in this film changes the very real and very conclusive evidence of Oswald's guilt, his sole guilt, because he acted alone in assassinating John F. Kennedy. One of the strangest and most persistent myths about the Kennedy assassination is that all sorts of people with secret and damning information about the assassination suffered mysterious or unexplained deaths, the implication being that they were systematically rubbed out to prevent what they knew from becoming public. This is widely believed, but it's actually one of the flimsiest and in fact silliest myths about the whole event. This myth is problematic because you can't really define its parameters. What is a material witness? Someone who was standing in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963 and witnessed the assassination? Hundreds of people did that. It's been 59 years since the event, so a lot of them are now dead. What counts as a mysterious death? A heart attack? A car accident? Slipping on the soap in the shower? How do you define it? Example. A woman named Arlene Roberts managed the rooming house where Lee Harvey Oswald was staying at the time of the assassination, and she gave testimony to the Warren Commission. She died sometime between 1963 and 1977. I couldn't pin down the exact date, but she was 61 at the time of her death. She had pneumonia, and she died of heart failure. Was she a material witness? And is that death mysterious? This is the kind of whack-a-mole game that you play when you start going down this topic. There's really only two quote-unquote mysterious deaths that you can pin down with any specificity. In November 1965, a reporter and minor TV personality named Dorothy Kilgallen died in her New York City townhouse. One conspiracy theorist, only one, Penn Jones Jr., made a statement, completely unsourced, that Kilgallen had supposedly told a friend that she was going to New Orleans in a few days to talk about an interview she'd had with Jack Ruby during his 1964 trial that would supposedly break the case wide open. Now, there are 5 major problems with this. First, we have no identifiable source for the statement that Kilgallen supposedly made. Second, several officials connected with Ruby's trial in Dallas, which found him guilty of murdering Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way, verified that members of the press were not allowed to speak to Ruby during the trial, which means that this alleged interview cannot have happened. Third, Kilgallen, a heavy alcoholic and drug addict, was in poor health for months before her death. Fourth, her death was a result of alcohol and barbiturate overdose, whether deliberate or accidental, the coroner couldn't tell. And fifth, Kilgallen's death occurred in November 1965. Ruby's trial ended in March 1964. To believe that she was bumped off to keep whatever secret she supposedly learned from that interview, you have to believe that she waited more than a year and a half before she decided to tell anyone about it. And the conspirators also waited a year and a half to whack her, and that they happened to get lucky because she waited longer to talk than they did to have her killed. I mean, does that make any sense at all? The only other mysterious death allegation worth discussing, because trust me, all the others are just like the ones I've already mentioned, the only other one is George de Mohrenschildt, a Russian emigre who had lived in Dallas and was one of the few people who was ever actually friends with Lee Harvey Oswald. De Mohrenschildt, who was elderly and suffering from dementia at the time, killed himself with a shotgun on March 29, 1977 in Palm Beach. Although he had suffered from mental illness for quite some time, ironically, one of the stresses that may have driven de Mohrenschildt to suicide was the incessant hounding by conspiracy theorists who insisted that he knew something nefarious about the assassination. As one of the very few people who knew Oswald well, de Mohrenschildt was about to be re-interviewed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. However, there's not a single hint of foul play connected with his death. In fact, in a strange twist, his suicide was actually caught on an audio tape that was taping a television program in the hotel suite where it happened. There's absolutely no indication of anything other than what it appeared to be, which was an old man suffering from dementia and depression who unfortunately ended his life. So that's mysterious? I mean, what's supposed to have happened here? Somebody broke into his hotel room and killed him and made it look like suicide? Where's the evidence of that? There's absolutely none. In any event, de Mohrenschildt knew Oswald in 1963, and anything additional that he knew about him which he hadn't already told the Warren Commission in 1963, he had an additional 14 years to tell the world about, and he didn't. These conspirators aren't too competent, are they, if they wait 14 years to whack somebody to prevent information from coming out that the victim otherwise had all the time in the world to tell. So, material witnesses did not die of unnatural causes. It's just an urban legend. It didn't happen. Whenever anyone talks about the JFK assassination, believers in a conspiracy invariably bring up a handful of kooky so-called witnesses who have told wild stories about what they think they saw on the day of the assassination. These witnesses' stories all suffer from the same defects. They were first told years after the assassination, they've changed radically over time, and they're all from what you might call unreliable narrators. I'm just going to go ahead and call them clown witnesses. One of these is a man named Virgil Hoffman, who suffered from a birth condition that made him unable to hear or speak. In 1967, 4 years after the assassination, Hoffman approached the FBI with a story that he had seen two men running away from the rear entrance of the Texas School Book Depository right after the assassination. However, just 2 hours after giving this statement, Hoffman returned to the FBI to amend it. He said that in that 2 hours he'd been back to Dealey Plaza and he realized that there was a fence obscuring the view of the book depository from where he'd been standing. So he didn't really see this after all. 10 years later, in 1977, Hoffman contacted the FBI again to amend his statement. This time he said he saw the two men running away from the grassy knoll and that they had guns in their hands. 11 years after that, in 1988, when Hoffman was interviewed for the ludicrously false British TV special The Men Who Killed Kennedy, Hoffman changed his story yet again, adding that the FBI tried to bribe him to keep him quiet. Hoffman's own father told the FBI, quote, "Virgil Hoffman has been a deaf mute his entire life and has in the past distorted facts of events observed by him." The father stated that he did not believe his son had seen anything of value, end quote. Virgil Hoffman is just not reliable. In any event, we know that no shots could have come from the grassy knoll anyway, so clearly he could not have seen gunmen running away from there. Clown witness. Another clown witness is Jean Hill, who called herself the Lady in Red because she was caught in photos of Dealey Plaza wearing a red raincoat.
And just about that time, we heard the sirens and everything began to pick up and everyone was so excited. And as they came down, the motorcade came down the slope, we all got caught up in the thrill of we're going to see a president. And
she was one of the few witnesses at the time, 1964, who thought they heard shots coming from in front of Kennedy, the grassy knoll area, though she admitted this was a general impression and she was not too sure about it. She also said that she saw a man running between the book depository and Elm Street, which she said, quote, "I am fully aware that his whereabouts have been known at all times and that it seems that I am merely using a figure and converting it to my story, but the person I saw looked a lot like, I would say, the same general build as I think Jack Ruby would from that position," end quote. The grammatical errors in that were endemic to the quote. In 1986, 22 years later, Hill embellished her initial sketchy and uncertain statement by saying that the man she originally described as having the general build of Jack Ruby, even though she knew it could not have been Jack Ruby because his whereabouts were confirmed to be elsewhere at the time, now she says that it definitely was Jack Ruby, even though that's impossible. Then in 1989, 26 years after the assassination, she changed her story again, adding that she saw a muzzle flash, a puff of smoke, and the actual figure of a man holding a rifle on the grassy knoll. Hill admitted that her own husband didn't believe she'd seen any of this and in fact was sick of hearing about it. So again, shifting stories told for the first time years after the assassination, unreliable witnesses, and in any event, we know these events could not have happened because we know from all the physical evidence that no shots came at Kennedy from the front. So Jean Hill is a clown witness. Last one that I'll deal with, a woman named Julia Ann Mercer, who was depicted in Oliver Stone's movie JFK. She gave a statement to police on the day of the assassination, November 22nd, that she was driving on Elm Street in Dallas and saw a green Ford pickup stalled partially up on the curb of Elm Street. She saw two men get out, and one of them had what appeared to be the size and shape of a gun case, though she never actually saw a gun. This was about an hour and a half before the assassination. Sounds suspicious, right? Well, until you see the testimony of a Secret Service agent, Forrest Sorrells, who testified that the Secret Service knew all about this truck that had stalled on the street, and in fact they were trying to clear it to get it off the motorcade route, so it in fact belonged to a construction company. Well, in 1983, 20 years after the assassination, Julia Ann Mercer changed her story. While talking to an assassination author, she claimed that the two men in the Ford truck were Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, even though the whereabouts of both of them at that time were proven to be elsewhere. These are all clown witnesses. They can't have seen what they said they saw. What they said they saw changed over many years, and what they said they saw can't have been real because we know that the facts indicate otherwise. Remember the bank robbery analogy. The statements of the clown witnesses are like the claims that somebody saw Jake at the bar the moment that we know for sure he was robbing the bank. For whatever reason, a lot of reasons, it's clear that these witnesses and statements are entitled to no credibility because the totality of the rest of the evidence indicates that they cannot be correct. The next major issue to deal with, we are getting toward the end here, thank God, is the House Select Committee on Assassinations. This was a panel set up by Congress in the 1970s to reinvestigate the assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. You may have noticed I've cited a lot of H.S.C.A. documents in these videos. With regard to some subjects, the H.S.C.A. was more thorough than the original Warren Commission. Now, at first glance, it might seem highly problematic for my conclusion that Oswald acted alone to note that the H.S.C.A. final report on the Kennedy assassination, dated January 2, 1979, concluded the following, quote, "The committee believes, on the basis of the evidence available to it, that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. The committee is unable to identify the other gunman or the extent of the conspiracy." End quote. However, this is not the full story. The H.S.C.A., which was established at the end of 1976, mostly as a result of renewed public interest in the assassination, thanks to the televising of the Zapruder film in 1975. Anyway, this commission was time and budget limited. As their investigation was running out of both time and money at the very end of 1978, they were finishing up their final report, which concluded that there was no conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination and that the Warren Commission had gotten it right the first time. That was what the original draft report, dated December 23, 1978, found. At the last minute, right as the investigation was finishing up, new evidence was brought to the H.S.C.A. regarding a tape recording, which was said to be a dictabelt recording from one of the police motorcycles in the presidential motorcade during the assassination. Two acoustics experts, Mark Weiss and Ernest Ashkenazi, testified that they had analyzed this tape and found a, quote, statistical probability that certain sound waves captured on the tape corresponded to gunshots, and that there were 4 of them, not 3. Based on this testimony alone, a slight majority of the panel altered their conclusion to what appeared in the final report, and several members of the panel dissented because they didn't buy the acoustic argument. That is literally all they had to go on. I should add that the sound waves on the tape that experts said corresponded to gunshots were not really recognizable to the human ear as the sound of gunshots. So it's not exactly accurate to say that the tape recorded the sounds of 4 gunshots. There were a lot of other extraneous sounds on the tapes, crackles of static and pops. After all, this was a crude dictabelt recording from the early 1960s. Now, the story of this acoustics evidence is very, very long and also super interesting. It's not printed in the main body of Bugliosi's book, and I think it should have been. Instead, it's in the endnotes, which in the book were originally published in 2007. They came on a CD-ROM that was attached inside the back cover, and you can see that I already lost mine. Fortunately, I saved the file on my computer, and I believe it's also available online. Here's the story on that tape. It was believed that one of the radio microphones on a policeman's motorcycle in the motorcade had become stuck in the open position and inadvertently recorded several minutes of audio, including the time span of the assassination. The tape was believed to be genuine, and the H.S.C.A. counsel that was most behind the tape evidence thought he knew exactly which policeman in the motorcade had done it. To make a very long story short, the H.S.C.A. conducted a fascinating audio reconstruction of the assassination in Dealey Plaza with various microphones and a test shooter in the school book depository and another one on the grassy knoll. The purpose of this reconstruction was to provide a baseline to figure out which sounds on the tape were extraneous, crackles, static, or backfires from auto engines or whatever, so that the experts could more easily isolate what might have been gunshots. The results were very confusing, to say the least, but the acoustical experts testified at the last minute, at the end of 1978, that there was a 95% probability that there were 4 shots, one of which came from the grassy knoll area. But because no one in the limo had been hit by shots from the front, that 4th shot had to have missed completely. So just as the committee was going out of business in January 1979, they hastily changed their final report, which otherwise identified not a single shred of evidence of a conspiracy, to claim that there probably was a conspiracy because a majority of the members were persuaded that 95% probability analysis of the tape meant that there had to have been a 4th shot. This seems like kind of a half-assed conclusion, but they simply had no time to investigate further, and in any event, they were out of money. In 1980, while there was already a lot of second-guessing and controversy about this acoustics issue, a rock band drummer from Shelby, Ohio, named Steve Barber, listened to a cardboard record of the Dictabelt recording, which was included in a special 1979 issue of Gallery magazine, a softcore porn magazine, which included in that issue a spread on the assassination. Now, listening to this very crude dupe of the tape, Barber picked up several voice transmissions in the background that could only have been picked up after the assassination had occurred, specifically cops on other channels reacting to what had happened in Dealey Plaza. But the key thing was, these faint voices, which amazingly hadn't been noticed by anyone before, came on the tape before the section where the acoustics experts told the H.S.C.A. the shots were. There were other clues, too, that the tape came from a different motorcycle than the one the H.S.C.A. counsel thought it was. Specifically, it seemed more likely that it was a 3-wheeled police motorcycle stationed around the Trade Mart, which was Kennedy's destination, rather than a 2-wheeled motorcycle in the actual presidential motorcade. A new acoustical analysis was done on this infamous tape by 12 scientists working for the National Research Council. This time, they focused on the question of whether Steve Barber was really hearing police crosstalk in the background or whether that was some sort of audio illusion. They concluded that Steve Barber was absolutely right. So in a follow-up report released in 1982, the National Research Council concluded that the tape was not made at the time of the assassination, but a minute or so after, that it was not in Dealey Plaza, but somewhere else, and that whatever those sound waves were that the acoustics experts thought were gunshots in 1978 were in fact something else. Now remember, but for that acoustic stuff that slid in at the last second as the H.S.C.A. was out of time and money, the draft H.S.C.A. report, the one dated December 23rd, 1978, would have been the final one, and it concluded that the Warren Report's conclusions, were correct, and that there was no evidence of a conspiracy. The acoustic evidence was the sole basis on which they changed the conclusion at the last minute. Once that acoustics evidence was discredited, that means that the rest of the H.S.C.A.'s investigation, which did not find a single shred of evidence for conspiracy other than the discredited acoustics issue, that means that they got it right. There was no conspiracy, no 4th shot, and Oswald acted alone. So there you have it. What the House Select Committee on Assassinations got wrong, which was the hasty final conclusion based on the bogus acoustics evidence, and what they got right, which was everything else, and which completely agrees with the Warren Commission, and in fact even expands our certainty that they originally got it right back in 1964. I don't see how anyone can argue with this, but somebody out there will probably find a way. Although it's a bit passé now, one major piece of media that influenced a lot of people that there was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy was a truly terrible 1988 British-made TV documentary series called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. This little piece of trash was especially corrosive on my as-yet undeveloped brain. I used to believe that there was a conspiracy in the JFK case, and it was this show that convinced me. It was broadcast in the U.S. on where else? The History Channel, poorly named. But anyway, this was before Oliver Stone's movie came out in 1991. The Men Who Killed Kennedy is an awful, awful show. It was so bad, and its conclusions so libelous and false, that the British government, through its independent broadcasting authority, required the company that produced it to tape another show debunking it less than a month after its original airing. And the producer of the show, Nigel Turner, was publicly censured by the British Parliament. Now, that is pretty extreme. A show so completely false that the government requires you to make another show debunking it. And lest you think that that's just censorship, there's a good reason why this was done, which I'll explain. The central claim of The Men Who Killed Kennedy is that the U.S. Mafia, wanting to whack Kennedy, hired 3 French hitmen to start blasting away at him in Dealey Plaza. The man who the show claims fired the fatal shot, from the grassy knoll naturally, was named Lucien Sarti, who conveniently died in 1972 and wasn't around to refute the show. As for the other 2, the French government, outraged at the show, within 2 days of its airing in October 1988, produced records to prove that one of the alleged French hitmen was in prison and the other was serving in the military at the time. And Sarti, the grassy knoll gunman, supposedly was also in prison on November 22, 1963. This incredible fish story was cooked up by a Hollywood screenwriter, Stephen J. Revell, who later turned up in the 90s after his reputation had been shredded by the disastrous Men Who Killed Kennedy. Anyway, he later turned up in the 90s as a screenwriter for Oliver Stone's film Nixon, which also traffics in conspiracy theories, although not as overtly as his JFK movie. Revell disavowed most of his own theory once the refutations came out. He said, quote, "I believe Sarti was involved, but apparently I was wrong on the other 2, end quote. Of course, Sarti was not involved. French records proved that he was in a hospital in a French prison at the time of the assassination. So in other words, the entire main thesis of The Men Who Killed Kennedy has been conclusively disproven. As if this was not enough, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, before connecting the dots with the French hitmen thing, gives the audience the ludicrous badge man theory. A Polaroid photo was taken of Dealey Plaza and JFK's limousine by Mary Moorman just as the shooting occurred. Her picture corresponds with frame 315 of the Zapruder film. This photo has been subjected to hyper-intensive analysis. Just as true believers search for the image of the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast, conspiracy theorists search for nefarious images in the Moorman photo, which, being a Polaroid from 1963, is not very precise. But conspiracy researcher Gary Mack, who later ran the very good Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas, which I visited, claimed that he made out the image of a man with a gun dressed as a policeman behind a fence on the grassy knoll. Of course, it is not an image of a man with a gun and a badge behind a fence on the grassy knoll. Most likely, it's a picture of a Coke bottle. Yes, you heard that right, a Coke bottle. So this show, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, not only had its central argument about the French hitmen completely disproven within days of its initial airing in 1988, but it was so unhinged that it turned a Coke bottle into a sinister assassin on the grassy knoll. I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad. And The Men Who Killed Kennedy suffers from the same defect as all conspiracy theories about the grassy knoll. We know for a fact that no shots hit Kennedy or any occupant of the limousine from the front. The shots that hit Kennedy were fired from behind, and they were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald. This show is absolute garbage, and its conclusions are laughable. I'm ashamed that I was taken in by it years ago, but fortunately, I know better now. Another widely believed myth about the assassination, which is completely unfounded, right up there with the mysterious death of material witnesses mythology, is the notion that the Warren Commission supposedly sealed its records and documents for 75 years, and that the American people won't know the truth about the Kennedy assassination until 2039, 75 years after 1964. This myth is also dramatized in Oliver Stone's JFK movie, but it is simply not true. This whole issue, the hidden documents issue, is a red herring, but the answer as to why it's false is complex, and it has to do with a lot of legal issues. Far and away, the best explanation of this entire issue is found in the endnotes to Bugliosi's book, not the body of the book itself, but one of the adjunct PDF files, which I believe is available online. I'll put the site here in the video, and it's the citation for everything in this chapter of this video. If you want more detail, you're just going to have to go there because Bugliosi laid it out quite well. Basically, this is the gist of it. The Warren Commission did not ask or order that any of its records be sealed for 75 years. In 1964, at the time of the Commission's report, there was, past tense was, a general rule in place at the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, that unpublished records in the files of executive branch agencies would be withheld from the public for 75 years after their creation, 75 years being their estimate of a normal human lifespan. Now, there's two things about this rule. First, it applied to unpublished materials. The vast majority of the Warren Commission's documents were published explicitly and deliberately by the Commission itself, so that rule didn't apply. Second, this rule doesn't exist anymore. It's been superseded by various other federal laws and regulations, including one specifically related to the Kennedy assassination and its documents. But before we get there, I want you to think of this analogy. The documents about the assassination generated by the Warren Commission are like water pouring through a cheesecloth. The NARA 75-year rule is like the cheesecloth, catching only a tiny bit of particulates in the water, the unpublished stuff, and the cheesecloth filters all documents emanating from the executive branch, not just the Warren Commission. There was absolutely no special treatment applied to Warren Commission materials that wasn't applicable to anything else that the executive branch produced. In any event, not only did the Lyndon Johnson administration, troubled by the misperception that the NARA rule was being used to shield Kennedy assassination documents from the public, not only did the administration authorize broad exceptions to the rules that encourage the release of all documents possible, but the Freedom of Information Act, passed in 1967, altered the whole situation and made it far easier to obtain documents from the federal government. Add to that a special law passed in 1992, largely in response to Oliver Stone's JFK movie, that even more of the tiny sliver of JFK assassination-related documents that were still withheld, the tiny residue of particles left in the bottom of the cheesecloth, should be released. That process, which continued through most of the 90s, resulted in over 99.9% of all assassination-related documents reaching the public. Basically, the only material left in federal files that has not already been subject to disclosure are pinpoint redactions in individual documents, so little phrases blacked out. Mostly these are the names of undercover agents or, on rare occasion, information related to intelligence gathering methods that aren't known to the general public. This falls under general regulations about disclosure of national security-related material, which are again applicable to anything, not just assassination-related material. When he wrote his book in the 2000s, Bugliosi interrogated the head of NARA about this issue, and that person, Stephen Tilley, reported that he and his staff could not think of any assassination-related document that had been withheld in full from the public. As a matter of logic, though, why would anyone expect there to be some sort of bombshell, smoking gun type of document in the government's files that disprove the basic conclusions of the Warren Commission? Every single time an assassination researcher has actually gotten a document that was previously withheld for whatever reason, it's turned out to be a nothing burger. And again, I stress this has not happened since the end of the 90s when virtually all of the documents were disclosed. Furthermore, in the vast majority of cases, it's not hard to get federal documents at all, at least historical ones, which assassination documents fall into the category of. So what I'm holding in my hand here, this is an FBI file on a World War II era German spy. This is for another historical project that I'm working on. It's not at all related to Kennedy. But this document, held by NARA, was classified at the time I requested it, and it was less than 75 years old. NARA received my request, reviewed it, and then coughed this document right up. I had to pay for copying, but that was minimal. This document contains the names of intelligence agents and even has letters signed by J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI at the time. They gave it right up. I didn't even have to file a Freedom of Information Act request. So the idea that there are secret documents in government files related to the assassination that will blow the cover off and tell a totally new story is just nonsense. If you like what I'm doing here, don't just subscribe. Well, of course subscribe, it'd be great if you did that, but it'd be very helpful if you'd click on one of my other videos. In addition to various videos on historical mysteries and fake historical narratives, I have another long-form, deep-dive history video, and that is on the meaning of the Titanic disaster of 1912, which I think is some of my best work on this channel. I'm primarily a historian, but I'm also an author and teacher. I teach history courses online at my website, seanmunger.com, and I've got several books available on Amazon, including a crime thriller called The Sun Thief, which is the sequel to In Deadly Mirrors that came out last year, and I also wrote a science fiction book called The Valley of Forever. I have a Patreon, that's patreon.com/SeanMunger, or you can donate to my Ko-Fi, the link is in the description here. I'll also put a link there to my Substack blog, seanmungerhistory.substack.com, where I write about world problems from a historical standpoint. Thanks so much for your support. Sorry to interrupt. Now let's land this plane and move into the final phase of the JFK assassination story. I've gone in a lot of different directions in these videos, and I've had to, because the public discourse on the assassination of President Kennedy is so gigantic and has been polluted by so many off-base innuendos that there's a lot to be addressed. But in this chapter, we're moving toward the close of this series. Let's get back to the central truth. Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy, and he did it alone. Once more, for those in the back, these are the facts you can't just get around. Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots. Eyewitnesses actually saw him doing the shooting. 3 shell casings were found on the floor of the depository next to the rifle in the building where he worked. His fingerprints were on the rifle and all over the boxes at the sniper's nest. The vast majority of witnesses heard 3 shots. The vast majority heard them coming from the direction of the Texas School Book Depository. Both of the shots that hit President Kennedy, the one that went through his neck and went on to wound John Connally, and the headshot that killed him, came from behind. His body showed no evidence of a shot from the front. The bullets and bullet fragments found in the limousine were found in front of where Kennedy was sitting, thus indicating they came from the rear. The bullets that were found were matched by ballistics to Oswald's rifle, to the exclusion of all other weapons in the world. He bought the rifle. Not only did it have his fingerprints on it, but he gave a photograph of himself holding the rifle, a photo signed by him, and which his wife admitted she took in the backyard. He gave that to a friend. Previous to the Kennedy assassination, Oswald used that self-same rifle to try to kill General Edwin Walker, which he admitted to his wife. After he escaped from the schoolbook depository, Oswald went on to murder Officer J.D. Tippit with a gun that he owned and whose bullets were matched by ballistics to have come from Oswald's handgun, to the exclusion, again, of all other weapons in the world. This murder and the flight away from it were witnessed in broad daylight by a dozen people. Oswald was a politically motivated extremist who was incompetent at almost everything in his life, except this one act of political violence. He was unreliable, such that no one would ever have trusted him to carry out a sensitive mission, and he was broke, indicating that he wasn't on anyone's payroll. There is no evidence that he was an agent working with or for anyone. There's no evidence that the man who killed him, Jack Ruby, worked for the Mafia or for anyone, and the murder of Oswald was clearly opportunistic, evidenced by the fact that just a few minutes before, Ruby was at a Western Union counter sending a telegram and could easily have missed his opportunity to kill Oswald. These facts are absolutely conclusive. Lee Harvey Oswald did it. There is no way around this conclusion. No evidence has ever come to light refuting them. Plenty of innuendo. We've had 60 years of books, movies, and TV specials full of innuendo, but no actual evidence. Therefore, you can consider these facts as completely uncontroverted. So once you conclude, as you have to, I think, that Oswald did it, the only remaining question is whether he was working with or for anyone else. And as there was no evidence that he was, and in fact the evidence is pretty overwhelming that no one who could have been motivated to kill Kennedy would or could have been dumb enough to enlist Oswald as part of their plan, it's therefore clear that he was not working with anyone. Indeed, all the evidence indicates that Oswald's plan was not hatched more than a few days before the assassination, and his whole opportunity depended on dumb luck. The presidential motorcade just happened to be planned to pass in front of the building where he worked, and he had a rifle that could do the job. So think back to the bank robbery analogy in the first part of this series. We have all the evidence we need to conclude that Jake robbed the bank. He did it, absolutely for sure. Therefore, something that appears at first glance to be incongruous with this conclusion has to be explainable in a way that's consistent with what we know happened. Jake can't have been in two places at once, so if we know he was robbing the bank at noon, a report that he was having a drink at a tavern somewhere else at the time must be incorrect. For whatever reason, it's incorrect. The evidence against Oswald has to be where you begin to evaluate the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And it's also the place where we end, because there's nothing out there to refute this evidence. Oswald did it, and he acted alone. I anticipate that I'm going to get a lot of pushback on this series that proceeds from what you might call whataboutism. But what about the theory of so-and-so that says the assassination was done by X and it happened like this? Oh, you didn't mention that. True, in many cases, I will never have heard of so-and-so and not be familiar with the particular theory you're talking about. There are so many of them. But sorry, conspiracy theorists, this is not the checkmate that you think it is. I do not have to have read every assassination book or seen every dumb YouTube conspiracy video to conclude that Oswald did it and did it alone. There's a very simple test that you can apply to any proposed theory that will tell you whether or not it's worth considering on its merits. Now, note what I said there, whether it's worth considering on its merits, not whether it is true. There's a difference. The test is this. If someone says, but what about X theory? Ask yourself, 1, does this theory ignore or dismiss without explanation the overwhelming evidence of Oswald's guilt? If, and only if, you answer no to that question, you move on to the second one. Question number 2, does the theory engage with physical or documentary evidence that can actually be produced? If and only if you answer yes to the second question, should you go on to consider the merits of that theory. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. The vast majority of JFK assassination theories, and I mean the vast majority, will fail to get past gate number 1. Almost all of them, from Jim Garrison's to Bill Cooper's, simply ignore the overwhelming evidence that indicates Lee Harvey Oswald did it, or else it dismisses it by assuming, without providing evidence of fakery, that it is somehow faked or fabricated. A tiny, tiny trickle of JFK assassination theories can get to the threshold of gate number 2, whether they actually engage with or rely on real evidence that can be produced, rather than just innuendo or supposition or conjecture. If, and only if, a proposed explanation can get past both gates, should you spend your time evaluating it on its merits, in my opinion. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time. Let me give you an example of how this test might work in practice. First, using a completely silly theory that no one in the real world believes, and second, using a theory that has actually been proposed. So I heard a joke years ago about the JFK assassination that it was secretly the Beatles. Paul McCartney was in the schoolbook depository, Ringo was on the grassy knoll, and John Lennon and George Harrison were, driving getaway cars or something. Obviously, this is a joke. It's not a real theory. No one would seriously try to propose this. But let's test it using the test that I just set out. Number 1, does this theory that the Beatles did it ignore or dismiss without explanation the overwhelming evidence of Oswald's guilt? Yes, clearly it does. If it was Paul McCartney firing from the schoolbook depository, why is there so much evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was the person doing it? The theory can't explain that without a generalized dismissal to the effect of, oh yeah, well that must all have been faked. Bam, we're done with this theory. You don't even need to delve any deeper into the Beatles theory, even if it was real, to know that it's crap, because it cannot reckon with the evidence of Oswald's guilt. Second example. Let's take the theory of assassination author David Lifton, who wrote that terrible book, Best Evidence, in 1981. I dealt with that theory in Chapter 22. As you recall, Lifton believes President Kennedy's body was stolen sometime between the time it left Parkland Hospital and the time it arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And during that time, the bullet wounds were surgically altered so that the autopsy would conclude that shots came from behind. Now, this is a ridiculous theory and totally impossible, and I refuted it in Chapter 22. But let's put it through the test. Does Lifton's theory ignore or dismiss without explanation the overwhelming evidence of Oswald's guilt? Actually, no, it doesn't, at least not entirely. Although Lifton does eventually resort to the deus ex machina of Oswald was framed somehow, his theory does make some attempt to explain why the autopsy proved that the shots that killed President Kennedy came from the direction of the schoolbook depository. So what about gate number 2? Does Lifton's theory engage with physical or documentary evidence that can actually be produced? Well, yes, it does. It does so badly, but at least it does. As you recall, Lifton seized upon one sentence in an FBI agent's report about what the president's body looked like when it was unwrapped at the Naval Hospital. In fact, his entire theory is based on that one sentence. Lifton is completely wrong and his theory is absurd, but at least you can't dismiss it out of hand. You realize it's absurd when you drill into the merits of it. But I used this example to demonstrate that the test that I've devised here is not result-driven. So let this chapter in particular be a guide for commenters or those who want to challenge my conclusions here with any phrase that includes the words "what about." 1. Does the theory ignore or dismiss the overwhelming evidence of Oswald's guilt? And 2. Does it actually engage with physical or documentary evidence that can actually be produced, as opposed to just innuendo or supposition? As we move into the home stretch here, it's worth asking the question in a broad sense. Why is there so much resistance on the part of so many people to accept the truth about the Kennedy assassination? The truth being that Oswald did it and acted alone. Why do so many people want so hard for there to have been a conspiracy? This is a difficult question to answer, and it gets us into a lot of psychological and sociological territory. As I said toward the beginning of the first video, 2 of the other 3 assassinations of American presidents were by lone wolf killers who were either mentally ill or political extremists, and almost all of the other unsuccessful attempts to assassinate presidents also fit this pattern. The only outlier is the assassination of Lincoln, which was a conspiracy, but a small one that was immediately and obviously exposed. As I think I've proven in this video series, we can also put the Kennedy assassination in the category of a lone wolf killer who was a political extremist. But why such popular resistance to believing that? And why is the Kennedy assassination special in that regard? Meaning, why don't vast segments of the American public also reject the historical facts of the Garfield, McKinley, or Lincoln assassinations? I think a lot of it has to do with the time in which it happened, and especially the time in which most conspiracy theories about the assassination have been swirling around, which is the last 60 years. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, during a moment of vast political and social upheaval in American society. It was during the Civil Rights Movement. The most intensive phase of American involvement in the Vietnam War was just about to start in earnest. Social movements around African Americans and other ethnic minorities, women, the LGBT community, these were seriously challenging previous orthodoxy about where these people fit into American society. These challenges ramped up tremendously in the later 1960s and completely altered the course of American history. The 1960s began an age of paranoia. I talked about this a bit in my audio course on the history of conspiracy theories in America, which is available on my website. Great societal forces were colliding in the 1960s, and paranoia and conspiracy theories are always a byproduct of social change. People come to distrust institutions. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, questioning institutions is good. Conspiracy theorizing is generally not a productive way to do that, though, but that's a separate issue. The gestation period of most John F. Kennedy conspiracy theories was the later 1960s. During that time period, there were two more high-profile political assassinations, those of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in 1968. Then in the 70s came the Watergate scandal, which had a profound effect on Americans' view of government and politics. This was all happening against the background of a shifting role of America in the world and shifting roles of people within America. The post-war economic boom was ending. America began transitioning to a service and information economy. Factories were shuttered. Livelihoods became harder and more precarious. And then especially since 1980, the social and economic safety nets that many Americans took for granted were increasingly frayed or outright dismantled. Is it any wonder that conspiracy theories flourish in this sort of environment? The assassination was also extremely traumatic for many people. Just ask any baby boomer where they were when they heard that John F. Kennedy had been shot, and you'll get a story. This was a sudden, shocking event with world-shaking consequences. It's difficult and uncomfortable to believe that history can be changed by a lone wolf killer with a $21 rifle and a chip on his shoulder. People often look for broader explanations, even if those explanations are more complicated or supremely complicated, as most conspiracy theories are. Furthermore, conspiracy theories are sort of a cult that separate good people from bad people. Conspiracy theories always involve some sort of secret or maligned knowledge that is believed by its adherents to be empowering. You know the quote-unquote truth about what really happened, whereas I am a brainwashed sheeple. It probably won't matter to you that what I believe is historical fact and what you believe is fantasy. It's the belief that's important to more people, not the facts, as my own experience with the college student of mine demonstrated. Remember, I mentioned in the first video where he wrote on his paper, "I know this is the answer you want, but this is not what I believe." I choose to believe in historical fact and what the historical evidence proves. The historical evidence proves that Oswald did it and that he acted alone. One last quick point, which is related to the subject of the last chapter. Part of why I think there's such resistance to accepting the historical facts of the Kennedy assassination is that to many people it feels like a moral surrender. If you accept that the Warren Commission got it right, It feels like you're somehow giving unearned trust to an untrustworthy institution, the federal government, which has done and continues to do all manner of horrible and unjust things from Watergate to Guantanamo Bay. Believing the historical facts of the Kennedy assassination seems like letting your guard down, like you'll be less resistant the next time the government tries to lie to you. I understand why people feel this way. But the thing is, it's not a zero-sum game. No institution is all bad or all good, just as no person is all bad or all good. If the government got it right in the Kennedy case, it doesn't mean that every spokesperson or every statement the government ever makes is always right. Nor does it mean that you, by accepting a conclusion that's factually supported, have abandoned your ability to tell the truth from lies. There are shades of gray here, and I know that many people are not good at perceiving shades of gray. Would you be surprised to learn that Lee Harvey Oswald, the murderer of President John F. Kennedy, doesn't seem to have hated the person that he murdered? Indeed, Oswald seems to have expressed admiration for him, telling his friend George de Mohrenschildt that he thought Kennedy was an excellent president. Yet, as we've seen, it's abundantly clear that Oswald did kill him despite having that belief about him. The motive was political, not personal. Oswald, misfit though he was, apparently could, on occasion, separate personal from political feelings. This shows us that it's more complicated than just a zero-sum game. Government bad, therefore anything government says false by definition. That's highly reductionist thinking. It's entirely possible to be highly skeptical of the institution of government as a whole and also recognize that the Warren Commission, an arm of the federal government, came up with a conclusion in 1964 that matches the facts of what happened to John F. Kennedy and the logical inferences that we can draw from those facts. So, in short, accepting the Warren Commission's conclusion doesn't mean that you trust the government. It just doesn't. It means that they happen to get it right in this particular case. The purpose of this video series is to explain and arrive at the truth of a historical event. I'm a historian. That's what I do. I try to explain and arrive at the truth of historical events. In this case, the historical events have been obscured by nearly 60 years of innuendo, obfuscation, and conspiracy theorizing. I think we should get back to the history. What happened on November 22nd, 1963? Here's what happened. Lee Harvey Oswald, a disgruntled loner and political extremist, used his own $21 mail-order rifle and bullets that he purchased to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. He fired 3 shots, 2 of which wounded the president, 1 of those fatally. Oswald acted alone in committing this crime. He was not working for or with anyone. There was no conspiracy. I believe I've set out and substantiated more than enough historical facts and documentary evidence to enable us to reach this conclusion about what happened on that terrible day nearly 60 years ago. I've gone through the evidence piece by piece. I've given you citations. I've shown my work. I've walked you through the logical conclusions and the reasoning that I used to get there. I've shown why much of the chatter about this historical event which pushes a different conclusion is uninformed, inaccurate, or simply wrong. This is despite the fact that, equally undisputed, that most Americans disagree with the conclusion that I'm reaching here. Sure, I wish more people believed in history, but I can't change that. What I can do is stand up for the historical facts and to try to get them heard above the noise and obfuscation that have obscured them. I believe I've done this, and if you've been with me on the journey through this vast and treacherous subject, thank you. It'd be great if you watched some of my other videos, almost all of them considerably shorter than this one. But thank you very much, and I'll see you again soon with more historical thoughts.